But I think even more because the time that we're in calls for something larger and deeper than I can actually imagine. So I thought I would start with the 5 remembrances. I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature of change. There is no escape from being separated from them. My deeds are my closest companions. The ground on which I stand.
Shodo, can you please say the last one again? It was cutting off a little bit, at least for me.
My deeds are my closest companions. I am the beneficiary of my deeds. My deeds are the ground on which I stand. So these are so ordinary and so obvious. And we live in a culture that forgets them, that fights against them. And I'm saying the culture, and there are many people among us who have not forgotten. I am a white, privileged person, and I can usually forget these things. I don't get sick often. Most of the people in my life who have died when it was their time. And basically I'm escaping a lot of things. And that's what we've been trained into. The technology can save us. And the people who know otherwise are mostly people of color and poor people and people in other places in the world. Old age, ill health, death, and loss. That's the nature of human life. In every circumstance, in every situation. And we have been trained not to believe these things. We have huge industries delaying death. We have huge industries fighting sickness. We have huge industries helping people to stay young longer. And look, here we are, we're together because we have technology that helps us to minimize the separation. But now we're in this time when people of all kinds are dying from the COVID virus, and our technology is not helping us. Our technology is 100 years old. Of course, the fact that we live in a country where the leaders are refusing to use that technology means we're having more deaths. And so it helps me to remember that it's not quite their fault. We cannot quite say you caused these deaths. We can say various things, but death is part of being human. Um, and then, in the middle of that, because a young woman took a video of the murder of George Floyd, something has changed about our knowledge of the society in which we live. Instead of it being one of those deaths recognized by and criticized by a relatively small group of people in this society, it has become seen by everyone. There was the video, there was the peaceful memorial invaded by Minneapolis police with brutality, with violence, and finally, eventually, a response that included, I'm not going to say violence, but destruction of property. And so, as far as I can tell, it was like a war in South Minneapolis, where I no longer live. And so this is called an uncovering, a lifting of the veil, an apocalypse. And at one time, two things are being seen. One is that we are not the masters of life and death. And another is the violence inherent in this society. And I ask myself about that violence. And I think about trauma. As a psychotherapist, I have taken trainings in working with people who've experienced trauma. I've read more. People are now working with generational trauma. And I also think about the trauma in the lives of the people who are hateful, who are murdering, who are causing violence, who are showing up with guns to defend the right not to wear a mask, who are hanging Black people. And the police call it a suicide until enough people scream about it. So things are being uncovered. And I ask, how did we get to be this way? A lot of people have asked, how did those people, those white people who came here from Europe, how did they get to be this way? You know, the American Revolution was in large part for the right to commit genocide among Native Americans and the right to hold slaves, because the English, bad as they are, were a little nicer than the colonists were. And in the past few years, I think I've been recognizing more history and coming to terms with my ancestors. As a children of Germans, I've had some recent history to come to terms with. But then I ask, how do people get to be that way? The book by Mary Trump, which I don't think any of us has read, seems to talk about that. In following the 3 executions and the legal defense and the stories told about those men, it was clear that all of them were traumatized in their childhoods. And I thought about my own ancestors. About 2,000 years ago, the Romans invaded Germany. They looked at the Germans and said, these are savages, these are barbarians. They don't even have villages, they move around. They have nothing to give us. And so we'll exterminate them. And so they came in, with their armies, with their slave soldiers, and they killed and they wiped out. And what I thought about, these are new thoughts, and I'll be looking for questions. What I thought about was that those of my ancestors who survived made a decision to go along with the program. They decided to become like the Romans, even if it was only because to save their lives. There's a Chief Little Thunder. I think he's either the grandfather or the great-grandfather of my friend Karen Little Thunder. And he made the decision at one point to surrender to the white soldiers in order to save the lives of the people who were in front of them. And the people who he knew and who he saw, he had to make the decision whether to let them become slaves or to let them become dead. One cannot criticize a decision like that, and the heartbreak that goes with it. And all around us, people are making those decisions. They're making the decision of whether to go along with the program of the militaristic bullies, of capitalism, of the forces of death, or whether to be dead. And so I am trying to say to myself, the neighbor who shouts at me, Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, what's his name, the Attorney General, those people are coming from a history of trauma, and that trauma goes way back. And it depends. I mean, I can imagine 2,000 years. I don't imagine back to the agricultural revolution so well, when because they started planting and saving grain, some people were enslaved and some people were masters and had luxuries and could do things like philosophy and art and study. And so there was a division among human beings. I can't imagine that time or why it happened. I just know that that's the foundation of the society we live in now. And the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of oil, coal, and gas, the ability to take from the earth what took millions of years to put into it and to use it all up, and to seem to control our environment. Those are our heritage, and they're our trauma. The fact that, well, I chose to live in the country, and there are gravel mines a few miles away from me, and every now and then we gravel the driveway. In the city, you have paved roads. What's the cost of that? There's a cost to the earth, and there's a cost to the human beings. That you live among pavement instead of waking up to the trees and the birds and a living, thriving natural world. Not that it's thriving out here either, but in comparison, there's life here. And so, when I think about the time that we're in, which includes massive demonstrations, it includes people who come in and exploit those demonstrations for whatever purpose. I won't go to a list. It includes repression, and it includes some amazing responses. The Minneapolis City Council deciding to defund the police, and then they have to figure out what that means. There are very exciting things happening now, and there are very painful and scary things happening now. And those of us who did not know about this, because of technology, now we can know about it. Because of a cell phone camera, we know one, and we've learned to be suspicious about all the rest. So we're in a time of change, and whether that feels like more loss or more opportunity and hope, that's different with each person. There are certainly quite a few people who are seeing it only as loss, who are shouting about their right not to wear a mask and acting violent. And then some of us, we watch these people and we try not to celebrate when someone dies from the virus. But we're in a time of change. And the Buddha didn't talk about any of the external things happening in his world. And Dogen didn't either. He was in a somewhat turbulent time and a time of change. And he said to his monks, don't talk about politics. But he also said a layperson can be enlightened just as much as a monk does. There's no difference. And he said, the entire world of the 10 directions is nothing but the true human body. The world we live in, not some other world, not the world of 1200, but the world we live in now, including violence, including uprisings, including sharp words being said. This world is our true human body. We're made by it, and we make it. I remember a boy who came into my therapy office, 20 or 30 years ago now. And it seemed his father was physically abusing him and saying terrible things to him, running him down. And I mean, you know what that does to a child. So I got both parents into the office and asked, and what the father said was, it was good enough for me. He was just passing on what he knew. There is so much of just passing on what we know with no imagination that things could be better. Here in Buddhism, we have an imagination that things can be better internally. We don't usually talk about the external world. And I'm saying, as it creates us and we create it, we have a responsibility. So Dogen says, to study the way with body means to study the way with your own body. It is the study of the way using this lump of red flesh. The body comes forth from the study of the way. Everything that comes forth from the study of the way is the true human body. And so here in the middle of whatever is happening in our world, still we study the way and we practice the way. I think what practicing the way means, I'm struggling with this a great deal. We know that sitting zazen is practicing the way. We know that practicing kind speech is practicing the way. And what practicing kind speech means can be pretty difficult. We know that kind action is practicing the way. And there's been so much seen of kind action in these days. And thinking about people who just came down to Powderhorn and down to Lake Street and helped clean up. They came from elsewhere. And thinking about the people who set up medic stations, who found living spaces for homeless, and then they started an encampment at Powderhorn Park. And people who organized food, and people who organized medical help, and people who organized counseling help, and then people who are looking for something that will last, because staying in tents in Powderhorn Park just doesn't last. And I'm thinking of people who took to policing their own neighborhood when the police didn't come. There are so many ways to serve. There are so many ways to do right action. There's so many ways in this time. And I mean, what I found myself doing was suddenly teaching classes online, which I'd never even thought of. And so the Dharma being offered is always a way of practice, a way of study, the way. This time calls for something to stop. If we look at the violence by police and the violence by white supremacists and the uprisings, we can see that there's a calling to stop white supremacy, to stop racism in all its forms, and classism. I think capitalism, but anyway, to stop the brutality in which the billionaires have received more government funds than all of the people who actually needed the money. There's an upside down world, and we're living through it. And some of us might feel at risk in it, and we might feel like it's dangerous to act. The young woman who took the video of George Floyd, apparently she's received a lot of criticism because she didn't go over there and interfere with the police. She's 17 years old and African American. And she said back to them, "Are you kidding? I would have been killed." Apparently that's what all the other people watching thought too, I would have been killed. Or they thought, well, you can trust the police. But that one act that she did, by putting her phone to film what happened, it changed the world. It changed the world we live in. And I doubt that she had that in mind. Some kind of compulsion made her do it. And because we have that film of clear and obvious criminality, we are seeing the rising of a new world. We are seeing white people trying to join in what people of color knew, all along. And so for us to recognize, we don't know what specific action will matter, but to stop, to recognize that our actions do matter. And this text says, "I am the beneficiary of my deeds. My deeds are the ground on which I stand." And I'm adding, my deeds create the world in which I live. My deeds create the true human body. So there's something that's changing. There's something that's being called on to stop. And right now, we don't know what will come of it. I think we're called to act with kindness and with courage. I never criticize people who take up guns on behalf of liberation. I don't think it's a wise course, but it's like it's not my life, it's their life. Our actions create ourselves. And our actions create the world. And the actions of people around us also create each other. It's a fundamental Buddhist teaching. I want to remember 3 people who've been killed recently, and then I think that will be the end. So first is my friend who was executed. His name is Dustin Honkin. He had been in federal prison for maybe 20 years. He was trying to avoid being imprisoned for making and selling methamphetamine, which he was doing because he wanted more money, because he had desires, which resulted in too many children who he was trying to support. And to avoid prison, he and his girlfriend killed 5 people, and 2 of them were children. Somehow, I never met that person. I was his spiritual advisor for a while when I lived in Indiana. And his last letter says some things that are, I don't know. I just want to read them. Many people in life don't get to say goodbye to their loved ones. They are snatched from life in an instant. I'm fortunate for this and have done my best to utilize this time to let everyone know how I feel and that my life was worth living because of them. Tomorrow I will go with love in my heart and with a peace of mind that I love many and am loved by many. Sure, there have been hard times, but life itself is hard, whether in here or out there. I've had a chance to study, to self-introspect, to learn about many things, and most importantly, come to understand myself. It's true I didn't have the life I wanted to have, but the life I have had is a life, one with many blessings from many places that I wouldn't have ever expected. So there was a time in this civilization when it was considered a good thing to have a long illness before you died because it gave you time to get ready. Dustin had that. He was executed for something he actually did. He was uncomfortable, and he was relatively safe, and he was able to use that time to change. George Floyd was murdered by the police on May 25th. He had been into sports in high school, in college. He was a rapper. Sometime in those early days, he said to his family, I'm going to change the world. And I don't know what happened, but he spent some time in jail and in prison for various offenses. The worst offense he ever did was armed robbery. He never killed anyone. And he kind of got religion, and in his 40s, he was all about doing good things, being kind to people, mentoring youth, volunteering. And he left Texas to work in Minnesota together with people that he already knew up here. And he was here living in as far as I can tell, an honest and upright life until that incident in which he was killed by Derek Chauvin. And like I said, if that hadn't been filmed, we wouldn't know. He didn't have years to contemplate his life, although he clearly did some contemplating. He didn't have lawyers filing warrants to stay his execution for months and even years. There were people shouting to stop, but nobody intervened. The other police didn't intervene. The medics did not come to offer first aid while he was dying on the pavement. He did not have a minister there with him during his last moments. Privilege. Lack of privilege. Being murdered on the street, no matter by whom, is the opposite of the benefits that Dustin had. And the responses to George Floyd have included, on the one hand, beautiful, creative activities, creation of community, fabulous artwork, writing, and people learning, white people working on learning about racism and starting to actually listen to the Black people who are telling them about racism. And on the other hand, we have open white supremacy at a level that we haven't had for at least 50 years. And then I want to mention a third person who I learned about accidentally. His name is Domingo Choc. He was from Chimoy, Guatemala. He was a traditional healer, an expert in plant medicine, and a practitioner of traditional Mayan religion. A quotation, he was widely recognized for his contribution in the field of science and medicine and was a part of an international scientific research project on ancient Mayan medicines. He was working with the University of Zurich in Switzerland and the University College London in England to document traditional Mayan knowledge of medicinal plants and herbal remedies. So he was killed for doing good, because the people who killed him, they say, were fundamentalist Christians, both evangelicals and Catholics, although that's not much information. He was staying at a relative's. They came in the night, they pulled him out of his house, beat him all night, and set him on fire. He burned to death. And there were people who saw it and nobody came to rescue him, probably because they would have been next. Fundamentalist Christians have been doing this kind of thing in Guatemala for decades. I happen to have read about it from the 70s. I haven't heard of anything quite that brutal, but that's probably just lack of information. And so he had no minister, he had no medical help, he had no time to write beautiful statements. His whole life, he was 53, his whole life was a gift, it seems to me. And it seems like there's an international outcry, and it's possible that some things might change, but I'm not there and I don't know. And any change that happens will be because of who he was, because he was internationally known, which is different from, I mean, George Floyd was an ordinary guy who had family and loved ones and was murdered on the street. So a person like Domingo Choc, who is indigenous in the way that all of our ancestors once were indigenous, totally rooted in the earth, communicating with plants. Don't know what else. that's dangerous to the machine. It's dangerous to what is ruling us now that pretends to be a democracy. He was more dangerous than the others, and he was punished more brutally. And the state didn't even have to do it. There were volunteers who thought they were Christians and who thought he was a bitch. So let me go back to the remembrances. Growing old is ordinary. Getting sick is ordinary. Dying is ordinary. Everything changes. One of the things I think that we can do in this time is accept that things change and to use our deeds, our actions, to help those changes move in the direction of something more full of life. Joanna Macy talks about 3 levels of activism. One of them is stopping the machine, getting in its way. One of them is creating the new world. And I think the third one is just basic spiritual practice. To create the ground on which we can all stand. I think we need meditation more than ever in this time. Our sitting creates a ground that is less vulnerable to the violence, to the uncertainties. And I don't mean it's physically less vulnerable. I mean that we create a field. We create the true human body as we allow it to create us. Our authentic response is called for. And our fear is part of that response. But this word from the 12 steps, they don't say they accept. We talk about accepting what's offered. But in the first step, they admit. I admitted that I was powerless over alcohol and my life had become unmanageable. And I like that term, admit, because it's being willing to know that things are the way they are. Accepting can sound like not doing anything about it, just leaving it alone and minding my own business. But I think that to admit what's happening, to support ourselves with Zazen, to look for kind actions, to continue educating ourselves so that we can stop being the sources of trauma. I recommend, I ask you to really join in the practice that is meeting the world that we're in whatever way is your way. Thank you. Questions? Or responses of any kind?
Shodo, thank you so
Yes.
much. That was a fantastic talk. I really have a lot of things to think about. So thank you. I remember earlier in the talk, in response to the systemic changes that things that we need to stop. I think that it's important to remember, and this is, but there's also a lot of things that we need to start. I think that our culture, the weird islands that we live in, how we're all so separate is a very unnatural way to live. And I think that a lot of the systemic change which needs to happen will happen when people start interacting with their neighbors and things like that. And that's, just like existing in a community. The machine, like I'm reading a book right now by Wendell Berry, and he's talking about agriculture in America and how, this is a tangent, but basically there's all these machines. Agribusiness has stopped what used to be a very common practice everyone was doing. Now only 5% of the population needs to be farmers. And so that frees us all up to do all these other things. But I think that farming was just kind of a necessary part of human life because it takes a community to do it. And so I think that, just kind of existing in a community, knowing your neighbors and things like that is the thing that we need to start doing in order to change police brutality and things like that. That's my 2 cents. I very much appreciate what you have to say, and thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your 2 cents. I will see if anybody else would like to add.
I'm just going to add the little chat from Sharon and Karine. Shodo, thank you for sharing the story of Dustin and how he responded to his life and death, and for your commentary on George Floyd and the changes we are all facing. And I echo that. I also want to add, I really appreciate your call to us to be present and be there with all that's happening, and then to be grounded, and then from there go forward with actions. So that I think is a very helpful message. Thanks so much.
I honor the way Clouds and Water is doing all this.
Shodo?
Yeah.
One thing that I find that meditation helps is that it's hard to not be swept away by the rage that I feel at what's going on and what has been going on. I remember, I go back to remembering the Selma March with John Lewis and Martin Luther King, and that's all coming back. But I've had periods in my life where I've just been so angry I could hardly deal with it. And I can go there now, but it's just really important to not let yourself get swept away. But it's very hard to not let yourself get swept away. That's all I had, just a comment.
Thank you. And I find that too. I have no idea why I am not more upset. But I'm really grateful because it allows me to function. I suspect it's the Zazen and the training.
Yeah. I think so too.
Okay, maybe one more.
I'd like to read something real quickly. Shodo, thanks so much especially for connecting the 5 remembrances to the whole world being the true human body. I hadn't thought about the relationship between those two. And it reminded me that the 5 remembrances are more like the central tenets of Octavia Butler's Earthseed than I'd realized. For context, Octavia Butler is a Black science fiction author, and Earthseed is a fictional religion from her work, The Parable of the Sower. So I thought I would read those because it's just about 10 or 15 words. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Thanks.
Yep. Good Buddhist. Okay. Thank you all.
Seamus, would you put the reference in the chat for people?
Oh no, I just closed. I had it up on my phone and I just closed out of it. But yeah,
Oh.
I can get it.
Just put her name and the book. That would be enough.
Okay.
Thanks. So I'll just add, I'm going to kind of take over for a moment from our Eno. We are going to do the Daishin Durrani next. This is for George Floyd, and we're still in we're calling the 49 plus days. So the traditional mourning period would be 49 days. It's more like 61 days for us because we didn't want to end it in Sesshin, and we also didn't want to end it on a Sunday. We wanted to have a time to have a closing ceremony. So the closing ceremony is actually going to be this Friday at 7. And we'll resend out the link for that ceremony in the Sangha News that will go out on Thursday, I believe. So anyway, Tai-san is going to lead us in this, and I will put it up on the screen for you to chant along if you want. So you'll be muted, and we'll just be listening to Tai chanting, and you can hear Tai and yourself. So let's see. I'm going to stop the recording.